a Patreon would be less us. Keeps the gears turning, the tea in the cup, and stops me from giving this whole thing up.
Hello, lovelies. Been a bit of a rough old week here at Stately Grim Manor. Had a bad flare-up with the edema and associated pain in my legs and back. And for the first time ever, spread to my hands. So I think a quick check with the doctor about swelling, painful extremities is probably in order. But it is happening a lot less often. But it does mean I've lost a couple of days of work, which is unfortunate. I think the economic problems and woes in the States are really starting to bite now as well, which doesn't hold out much hope for a fruitful and profitable Christmas season. So I guess we'll see how things go there. Then again, role-playing games have in the past tended to be fairly recession, even depression proof, because they're so cheap and such good value for money. But that's less true now than it ever has been before, so I guess we'll see. I'm not sure what we're playing on Sunday, whether T-shirt's stepping in or I'll be running Machinations because weeks have been missed. I don't know, we'll find out and keep an eye on the socials and so on to see what's going there. I am still working, albeit slowly, trying to largely clear my plate of anything urgent so that nothing is super pressing and I can catch up on things that I've promised to do for people. But, can't control the old health thing. The Kirk blowback has calmed down. In fact, the guy seems to have been fairly forgotten in the news cycle. So I'm curious. I'm curious why I am less bothered by the backlash from the right than I was in the past, from the backlash to the left to even the slightest possible disagreement. I guess because it's not as surprising. Maybe all the counselling and other mental health work I've been doing have finally borne fruit. I'm not sure. It's a weird thing. I'm wondering whether people on the other side have calmed down a bit. I don't think Ultra is much of a weather vane on that score, because he's always been a bit raw. So, and he certainly hasn't calmed down, but I'm wondering if other people have, and they might even be prepared to apologise to me, perhaps, a little. Does that sound a bit overly optimistic? Maybe it does. I don't know. I guess we'll find out. My TikTok, for whatever reason, probably because I stop and listen to those sorts of things, has been stuck on a lot of English and grammatical sort of things lately, and especially a lot of videos talking about how most Americans are at or under a 6th grade reading level. Now, that doesn't mean you can't read or you can't write. It means you're functionally illiterate, which doesn't mean you're illiterate. It means you can function, but when it comes to any sort of deeper meaning or nuance of language, of understanding and extracting meaning from the text, reading the subtext and so on, that the ability is not there to deconstruct and reconstruct meaning and so on. And I wonder if that might not be part of the problem, because people do react on such a surface level, and spoken English is not that different to written English when it comes to this, when it comes to deciphering and understanding what people say. And Americans do have a much more direct language style than the English. We are very deflective. We leave a lot to subtext and implication rather than stating it boldly as text. Not that our overall literacy is that much better, but it is better. So maybe that is how we arrive at this phenomenon where I make a video after the death of Charlie Kirk, and I explicitly set out what I'm doing in that video. I say just because someone is dead doesn't mean that we should whitewash over the horrible things that they've said and done, and that we should try to remember people as they actually are. I reference Speaker for the Dead, Orson Scott Card, maybe a slightly obscure reference to a lot of people, I don't know, but Google is free. And I also go on to say that I wouldn't have a lot positive to say about him, but there'll be plenty of that elsewhere. And then I go into who I saw him as. At no point did I celebrate his death, right? But people have acted and reacted as if I was joining a queue to piss on his grave or whatever else. There is this taboo of speaking ill of the dead, but sometimes the dead are cunts. It's just the way it is. So I've been curious and sort of mulling this over the past couple of weeks, and there's got to be a sort of scale here, right, over whose deaths it is okay to celebrate and whose deaths it's not okay to celebrate. Right, Stalin died in 1953 in a puddle of his own shit and piss, in part at least because he'd purged a whole bunch of doctors and so nobody knew quite how to treat him, which is sort of poetic justice, I guess. Celebrations broke out all around the world in the diaspora of Russians who'd fled Stalin's regime, probably some quiet celebrations in the old Soviet Union as well. I don't think anyone would have been, or at least it would have been massively uncommon for anyone to upbraid anyone for celebrating the death of Stalin. Right? And, I mean, the more obvious go-to would be Hitler. So, given that people have a 6th grade reading level or less, let's do that one as well, shall we? Hitler fought in World War One. When it comes to the atrocities of the Nazi regime, he didn't actually kill anyone personally. He just signed the orders or told people what to do and left them to it, and manipulated and wielded power and started wars and all the rest of it. But his own hands were fairly clean, right? So is it okay to celebrate the death of Hitler? I don't think that would be terribly controversial, or serial killers or murderers. But is it limited? So it's clearly not limited to people who've done actual direct harm, but also people who have ordered or created the environments in which massive harm can take place, right? Nobody's going to mourn a serial killer. Few people are going to mourn a murderer. Maybe some extremist Jains might be upset. Jain. It's a religious sect known for its extreme pacifism. Maybe some of them would upbraid you for celebrating the loss of any life, no matter how monstrous. Personally, I don't believe in state execution. Seems a touch hypocritical, and it's more valuable to learn something from murderers and the worst kinds of criminals than it is to just off them. Yeah, as I say, it seems a little bit hypocritical. But equally to Hitler, I don't think anyone particularly mourned the death of Goebbels, who was just a propagandist. So clearly there's some sort of scale here where celebrating some people's deaths is perfectly okay, celebrating other people's deaths is not okay, and then there's going to be some sort of crossover zone where it could go either way, depending. But I don't think people are thinking in that way. I think people are thinking purely ideologically. And it's not that I have ever been particularly shy of expressing my ideologies, so of course I'm not going to be particularly upset at the murder of a Christo-fascist, a racist, someone who decried empathy and regarded other people's deaths as an acceptable cost for the questionable utility of the right to bear arms and its relevance in the modern world, amongst many, many other atrocities that he even if he didn't believe them, he expressed them and other people swallowed them. So, of course, I'm not going to be terribly upset when that happens to someone. Just as I'm sure many of the people so upset at me would not react particularly badly if, say, Hassan Piker was stabbed in the heart with a bayonet or whatever else. I don't think they'd be too upset. I don't think they were quick to excuse the murders in Kenosha from the fact that the shooter could not have known that they were dodgy, horrible people. But that made those deaths acceptable somehow. Or the deaths that led to the Black Lives Matter protests, George Floyd in particular. People were quick to parade his criminal record around as if that somehow made his death okay, his unlawful slaying by the forces of the state okay. So there's tribalism at work too. But anyway, it's all very interesting and a fascinating little knot to pick at, which is what I'm fixated on. But I'm not that upset when far-right people get their panties in a bunch and run screaming into the hills at the sight of me. I'm not sure why, really. Anyway, onto the video commentary. On the Chris Foss video, Edwards says, I'm unsure that Foss was used in the US sci-fi paperback market. Most of it looks unfamiliar, yet the influence is obvious. Well, Foss, his artwork was used on American paperbacks, according to Google, and a quick scan through a few pages. But he did first gain prominence on British covers, and he influenced American artists, at least. His work has been featured on covers for books like the Foundation trilogy and E. Doc Smith's Lensman and Skylark series, and I think that includes the international editions from what I was able to find by quickly poking around. So maybe not as prominent on US covers, but certainly prominent on British and European covers. Umbra Ludus says the term for doodads and extra model bits on scale models of spaceships and things is greeblies. And also says, thanks by the way for the Foss book. I'm a fan of all those old TTA handbooks from days past. Yeah, it's a bit surprising that the RPG didn't do that well, but I don't think the system was particularly interesting to anybody, and not using the original artwork probably didn't help particularly either, but was outside of their scope. It also wasn't particularly well advertised, and the market is older people, I guess, who remember these books. So to make this clear, greeblies is the bits and pieces, often from old battleship model kits, if I recall correctly, and the term for miscellaneous monsters is griblies. Greeblies, griblies, greeblies, griblies. There's your nerd Duolingo for the day. On the video, legitimate concerns. Rojol Banji says, and of course this meandering pontification ignores the difference between illegal immigration, the actual documented incidents of criminal behaviour, throngs of immigrants waving the flags of their homeland and protesting while the native population is not allowed to fly their flag, etc., etc. People can bring their culture and still assimilate, but the UK is following France and Germany's example. To the devil with your laws. Sharia law is being demanded. Western women are valued far less even than their own. So that culture clash has led to horrible incidents. I don't know why you rambled on about grooming gangs. Rapings and killings are a front and centre concern. If there is even one incident, it's one too many. But when you have many, as in the case of Germany, the government needs to step in and ask why, deport the bad actors, and certainly not try to jail its citizens for voicing their concerns. Why might Germany be nervous about racism and the blaming of minority populations for things? Strokes beard meaningfully. Right, well, the whole point of that video, which you missed, was that these concerns are not legitimate. Illegal immigration, which is most often asylum seeking, was included. And that was part of the point, and that's only 4% of total immigration. Okay? So the vast and overwhelming majority of immigration is not that, and it also means that legitimate reasons to immigrate, such as asylum seeking, end up labelled as illegal immigration. The very conflation that I was complaining about, in part, in the video itself. Yes, there will be immigrants who are criminals. There will also be native people who are criminals. Turns out, native people, on both a per capita and on an overall numerical basis, are responsible for more crime of most kinds. Poverty is a confounding factor, of course, because criminality tends to rise with poverty and difficult conditions, and the longer and worse we keep these people impoverished, the more likely they are to turn to various kinds of crime. But then that issue is also further compounded by the fact that if you're waiting on your asylum process to be completed, if you regard your ability to stay in a country as being somewhat fragile, then you're rather less likely to do anything that might jeopardize that status. So that acts as a pressure in the other way. People wave their flags because it's a way of identifying their community. In America, different states within the Union have flags, right? In Britain, technically, different counties have their own flags, and the separate countries within the United Kingdom each have their own flags. So you've got the Union Jack, you've got the Cross of St. George for England, and you have the Dragon flag for Wales, and Northern Ireland has its own flag, and Scotland has its own flag. So, what exactly are you complaining about here? The Scots identify with their own flag as a community, but a community within the United Kingdom. So, I don't know what point you think you're making there. You're certainly perfectly allowed to fly your flags as an Englishman or as a member of the United Kingdom. However, you have to acknowledge that the Cross of St. George has been a racist symbol since football hooliganism in the 70s, at least, if not before, and as a symbol has almost been entirely co-opted by racists as a way to sort of territorially piss wherever they go, hanging the flags up everywhere as an exercise in intimidation, but a deniable exercise in intimidation. It's not unlike the "it's okay to be white" posters that went up, because obviously that is a sentiment with which one can agree. However, the meaning, the subtext of those posters was something else entirely, angled to make other people feel unwelcome. Text and subtext added again. Sharia law is not being demanded. I don't know where you get that, except the paranoid rantings of Uncle Boot Boy on Facebook, perhaps. Yeah, I mean, the whole point of that video, which you missed, was everything that you raised as being a legitimate concern is not a legitimate concern. Right? I mean, that's the whole point, and you missed it all. Errors will multiply says, I still can't get over the fact that Honey Badger Radio men's rights activists are parroting the "they can't be refugees, they're fighting age men" stuff. They've spent decades talking about the disposable male and criticising things like the White Feather campaign, but the second it suits purpose, it becomes fine to shame men for leaving war zones or forced conscription if there are women and children to protect. I really didn't want to be right when I said 5 years ago that I suspected they were actually traditional conservatives hiding behind men's rights, but I think I was. I don't know, I think it might be a bit the other way around. Right? That they have been audience captured and so pushed and shoved by the people that should be all about egalitarian equal rights and making sure that everyone is well served by the state and safeguarded, and that safety nets and so on are in place. You would think they would be on the left because that's where the values coincide. However, there is such ingrained cultural hatred towards men that however left-wing you are, if you express even the most cautious and timid support for men, you end up being categorized as right-wing anyway. So I think that's part of it. I also think it's somewhat cynical in that that's where the support for men's issues is. That's where the potential political leverage is, and that's where the money is for these causes. Whereas the pseudo-left couldn't give two tugs of a dead dog's cock for men's problems and issues, up to and including male genital mutilation or disposability. So I used to have a lot of time for them. I share your disappointment, but it also on an intellectual level I can kind of understand how they got there and why. 3 Orcs says, everything I heard is how screwed the UK is. It's over for you guys. Here in the US, they're trying to stop that from happening here. It's not. We're okay. I think we're doing a lot better than the US, and that's even taking into account digital ID and internet censorship and so on into account. At least we don't have Keir Starmer trying to get late night TV hosts fired. At least we don't have troops on the streets. At least we don't have a masked, unidentified Gestapo going around kidnapping Romanian builders off sites and shipping them to, I don't fucking know, some death camp in Grimsby or something. So, you know, comparatively speaking, we're doing fine. I'd worry about the States. Smitumi says, the other thing about fighting age men is that a bunch of them are Afghans and they're escaping the Taliban. How many British families would send their sons away if a nationalist militia took over the country and started forcing conscription? Yeah, a lot of people developed bone spurs or fled to Canada or Mexico when America started drafting people. More recently, I guess the Ukraine war is another example. A lot of Russians and a lot of Ukrainians fled the country when it looked like they might be scooped up and sent to war. And, you know, more power to them, really. So, yeah, that is the other thing you have to bear in mind. Fighting age men are working age men, but they're also men who might not really want to be conscripted either into a criminal gang of invaders in Russia's case, or a religious band of nutcases who think suicide is a virtue, as you see in Afghanistan. But, what do I know? On the Natural Fantasy review, Edspace says, so I won't go into the colonialism stuff that I mentioned in the review. As one thing I learned being part Irish is that people get uncomfortable with me broaching the subject. That said, there is an interesting conversation that comes up, mostly when content that positions, I don't know what that word is, in certain ways, gets people questioning its inclusion at the specific gaming table. That being, why do you have to make the game political? And part of me wonders if political is being used incorrectly here, as English isn't my first language, neither's Gaelic, so I had to use Google Translate. Interestingly enough, the ancient Greek god Hephaestus is sometimes depicted in a wheelchair due to his malformed leg. Yeah, when it comes to Hephaestus, it's a feature, not a bug, but it often makes a lot less sense in game settings, and Natural Fantasy did not feel like me to be the place to include that kind of thing. The Techno Fantasy Atlas would have been a better place to do that. When it comes to colonialism, not a fan, but I think we also have to acknowledge that some colonial powers were a lot worse than others, and basically, given the historical context, you had to choose someone or be conquered by someone, and there were certain conquerors that were better than others. I think we can acknowledge colonialism is bad, sure, but some is worse than others. When it comes to politics in games, right, there's politics and there's political. We really need a better way to differentiate this, right? So if I'm playing a game where one of the major powers in the world is colonialistic, monarchical, and maybe your characters play as the retainers of some noble who is vying for power at court in order to hopefully get some of these choice new duchies or whatever that are being carved out of other nations. That is a political game, even if it's not directly passing comment on colonialism in the real world or whatever else. It's a game that involves politics, but it's not political, not propagandistic. That's the word I tend to default to differentiate. So you can say there's a political game, but there's also a propagandistic game. A propagandistic game really bluntly kind of smacks you over the head with its politics and its choices, aesthetic and otherwise, its plot lines, everything else. It all relates back to the real world in some way. Now you can do that in a satirical way, which further complicates matters, and that can be fine and fun. But most propagandistic material is of lesser quality because the message overrides the art, right? So that's where I would put the difference. Is this preaching at me? Is its message so blunt and over the top that it's hammering me on the head constantly? That's where the difference is, I think. And lastly, given the possibility of peace finally in the Middle East, though I doubt it very much has anything really to do with Trump, on the Kalergi Plan video, Spasicane says, "Are you Jewish?" This is a common question that comes up. I, of course, said, "Let's pretend that I am. Why would that matter?" And he said, so Jewish. No, I'm not Jewish. Or Polynesian, or Chinese, or mixed race, or anything else that these knuckle-dragging half Neanderthals like to imply or say it to me as if it was an accusation, as if it would make any difference to what I'm saying, which it doesn't. But man, is that just emblematic of the massive anti-Semitism that is out there in the world now, and how much of a shame that is, and how much of it can be laid at the doorstep of BV and Israel. But it does make comment sections a lot harder to negotiate if you have any sense of nuance or history, which unfortunately I do. Zang.
Postmortem Studios, role-playing games, and a lot more to die for. Post-mort.com.
Get some plastic surgery against this society. Entropy, apathy, morality, totality. Makeup of your final days. Survival of the fittest haze. Might is right on praise. Smoke and mirrors, twisted maze. Are you strong